refreshing to see that harm reduction is still alive and well, at least in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, and England must do much better. So I've been asked to talk about the Psychoactive Substances Bill. When I got the call to do this, my heart sank, not least because the MPSs are not my favourite topic. One, because stating the bleeding obvious, they are a result of prohibition. We have these drugs because we've made other drugs illegal. And the illegal drugs, actually we know a lot more about, and we can make use of them much safer. But we've just opened a Pandora's box through bad policy and bad drug laws. And I'm afraid to say that we are going to continue the track of bad policy and bad drug laws in the Psychoactive Substances Bill. I have called this an unnecessary and unworkable law, and I'll explain why as we go through. So this is Les Iverson. Many of you will know him. He is the chair of the Advisory Council of Misuse of Drugs, of which members are who have spoken today. Alex and Harry's on the panel with me, so it'll be really interesting to get some of their insights. But it's been described as a cat and mouse game, and I think what Josie has just presented is a really great example of that. I mean, there is a core set of these drugs that are problematic, that are being used, that we could deal with. But there's this idea that the 100 drugs being produced every year, that we need to deal with them. We have to stop it. We have to respond to each and every one, regardless of harm, regardless of prevalence, which is really important. So this narrative in the media especially has been very much about these very clever, evil chemists producing these drugs to beat the drug laws, and we can't stay on top of it without asking the question, well, do we need to stay on top of it? Should we have a rational response to this? And it's really great that Wales is having a rational response with Wendenos. Added to this is the fear that was described so eloquently by Bengt and by Ethan, the fear of the harm of these drugs, the damage that they're doing. And this has been going on for 5 years, 6 years since the emergence of methadone back in 2009. So one of the earliest so-called deaths related to methadone was Gabrielle Price, a young girl who died in late 2009, and whose death was attributed to methadone, and where the headline there says, the dealer of the drug is untouchable. In fact, the young girl died of natural causes. This made the front page. The actual cause of her death was reported probably on page 10 or 20 of the newspaper 3-4 months later. Similarly, we had two young men, Louis Wainwright and Nicholas Smith, who were alleged to have died from methadone as well. And in fact, their deaths were to do with a cocktail of alcohol and methadone. But again, this kind of hyperbole around it, the idea that across the land, our streets are awash with MPS and young people are dying. And yes, there are some tragic deaths associated with these drugs. But as Alex clearly showed this morning, it is a tiny number in comparison to what is the real problem with our drug policy at the moment, which is our inability to deal with the deaths that are resulting from heroin and morphine use, and in particular around the treatment system becoming one that is not supportive of the choices of people accessing it. In addition to this, and this is where I want to bring in the lobbying around it, over in the corner you'll see call to close head shops as experts warn legal highs will kill more people than heroin within 2 years. This was from 2014, when we got the statistics that showed that we had a 32% increase on last year's death. This year we have a 64% increase on 2 years before, as Alex has said, the highest since records has begun. Now, the number of deaths associated with legal highs is linked to a report from the Centre of Social Justice. Many of you will know the Centre of Social Justice. This is an organisation that produced the report Broken Britain. I think it's very unhealthy to talk about a broken society. This is a centre that was set up by Ian Duncan Smith. When we talk about evil and venal persons, as Ethan put it, the response is all I need. So this report is the report that the government is currently using to legitimise the progression of this bill through the House. I particularly like the Vice. Alex has already explained why the stats are wrong. They attribute 97 deaths to legal highs. In fact, those 97 deaths are attributable to MPSs. We know there is a problem with definitions in terms of MPSs and legal highs. And in fact, MPSs also include very traditional drugs like ketamine and GBL that actually have been controlled for a number of years now. So there's a problem, there's a misrepresentation of this. And as Alex has said, there's 14 or 18 deaths this year associated with these drugs. And I like the way that Vice has worded this. It's just utter bullshit. So prevalence, what about prevalence? The data around this is particularly weak. We have the crime survey for England and Wales. There are weaknesses in that survey, which I can talk about in the question and answers. This is the GDS, the Global Drugs Survey. It also has problems, it's self-reported, but I think it gives a really good sense of what people who are using drugs are actually using. So this is the top 20 from last year's data, which Adam Winstop sent over a few days ago. There are a number of legal highs in there, and if we want to talk about the actual legal highs, let's talk about alcohol, let's talk about tobacco. But in terms of the legal highs that the media has us absolutely in terror about, we have salvia, etsalam, and also poppers and nitrous. Nitrous being particularly popular, but for anyone who's tried nitrous, really, should we be calling it a drug at all? Standards, people. That being said, I do not want to really sort of make light of where the problems actually lie. And Harry's going to talk a bit more about this in his presentation. But there are particular groups who are suffering significant harms in relation to the use of these drugs. But it's not about the drugs, because drug policy is never about the drugs. It's about everything else around it. It's about social control. It's about oppressing people. It's about the othering of certain groups. It's about blaming others in society for your problems rather than getting you to look up and blame who's responsible. So let's look, why are certain young people, certain cohorts injecting these drugs, putting themselves at real risks? I would argue that they're a very similar demographic to those that we saw in the 1980s, where we saw huge decimation of industrial industries in towns where jobs have been taken away. And in the same way that occurred in the 80s and we had a rise of heroin use amongst a specific population, we're seeing a rise in use of these drugs problematically because we're not investing in young people, because we've given up on the young people, because this government, based on all of the budget cuts that came this week and everything that's gone for the last 5 years, actually hates young people. At the same time, people in prison, again, Josie's picked this up in her presentation, but if you warehouse people who are vulnerable and marginalised, people with mental health problems, people who have suffered trauma, people who do not belong in prison, who have committed non-violent offences, not just drugs, other offences, then eventually they are going to seek out some sort of relief from that. Any of us would if we were in that situation. So let's target the problem. But what this bill does, this bill seeks to ban everything that could potentially interact with our brain. Everything. So I'll get into a little bit of that in a moment, but just to go through quickly what the actual offences that are going to be created under the Act. So you can read through these yourself. We've got the great old aggravated supply, which we saw introduced in 2008, I think off the top of my head. No, 2005, drugs bill. Thank you, Alex. 5. Where you have an offence, aggravated offence, if you supply in the vicinity of a school. Well, if you live in an urban area, you're particularly disadvantaged by this aggravated offence. In fact, none of these really have been used by the courts or by the crime prosecution services, not least because judges can actually reflect this in sentencing, and some judicial discretion is a good thing. Possession with intent to supply is an offence, importation and exportation is a supply. So this is the list, the usual that you would expect to see. The government has said that they will not create an offence of simple possession because they do not want to needlessly criminalise tens of thousands of young people every year, something they are currently doing with the Misuse of Drugs Act, but don't seem to want to have a conversation about that. But in fact, this bill does create possession offences. It creates a number of very strange possession offences. Production for personal use, which actually isn't going to be that strange. So you think about some of the inert substances, some of the psychedelics, like the Hawaiian wood someone will correct me on this, but the Hawaiian baby wood. It's an inert substance that needs to be processed in order to have a psychoactive effect. So that technically a person could buy that substance for their own personal use, process it to get the psychoactivity, and then fall under foul of the Act. More worryingly is the importation for personal use, because we know this Act aims to close head shops, and I'll talk about that as well. But when the head shops close, what will happen? People will shift online. And they will not shift online to UK companies, because the UK companies will equally be shut down or voluntarily respond to this Act. And so what we will see is people importing from abroad, young people importing for their own personal use and for social supply. So they will be caught under this Act. They will be criminalised. So this defeats the intention of this bill or the government's process. And particularly perverse, in my view, is the idea that we're making a possession offence of a psychoactive substance a specific offence for those who have been deprived of their liberty because of criminal activity, as opposed to those who are in the community. So that kind of sense of community equivalence in the treatment of people in prison is being undermined by this, and again could be dealt with through the current route of prison disciplinary processes. These are the penalties. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but just to say no proportionality. So it doesn't distinguish between low-level offending, potentially possession offences, for example, under production, under importation or exportation. Doesn't make any distinction between the different activities along that scale. And here's when the fun starts. The meaning of psychoactive substance. Can I just say, I mean, Ethan's call to us to be, to call out when things are wrong, the need for us to be advocates, to challenge the system. This is one of them. I mean, this is a totalitarian bill. This is a bill that seeks to limit what we can choose to do with our own brains, with what our receptors do. So this is the definition, and I'm not going to go into it in a huge amount of detail, but just to say, so the Act creates a substance is a psychoactive substance if it's capable of producing a psychoactive effect in the person who consumes it. Sorry? Well, we can talk about the exempted substances in a moment. In terms of the definition of psychoactivity, I just want to pick up on the point in orange in point 2, or subsection 2. So it will be defined by stimulating or depressing the person's central nervous system. It affects the person's mental functioning or emotional state. So that's the definition of psychoactivity on unknown substances. So it bans everything, and I'll show you in a moment, but it also bans nothing. So the groups on the right, see if I can get this to, the groups on the right, these are all exempted. Food, alcohol, cigarettes, pharmaceutical products, including homeopathic medicines. Homeopathic medicines are exempt, evidence. Controlled drugs are exempt from the Act. Genius. What's not exempt? Well, incense. It is a sad, sad day when the Home Office has to make assurances to the churches to say that your priests will not be prosecuted for using incense. I mean, whoever at the Home Office had to do that must have been deeply embarrassed, hanging their head going, really? Really? Equally, I mean, one of my favourite shops, the Body Shop, what's going to happen to my massage oil? I smell it, makes me happy. Makes me happy. We know what this bill is aimed at, though. It's not those substances, and in reality, the police will not be interested in incense in church or massage oils. What they are interested in is basically quelling a trade that, exists to some degree, but doesn't have the level of harms that is being advocated by politicians and by media. So we have poppers in the corner, and we have nitrous oxide, and these are some of the substances that it's hoped that the Act will catch. So back to psychoactivity and the definition, and this is where I get on to the point of it bans everything, but it also bans nothing. So the ACMD, which is a collective, as you all know, of very wise women and men, and they weren't consulted on this bill before it was drafted. It was much a shock, I believe, to them as it was to the rest of us, which has been well reported in the papers. But on the 2nd of July 2015, they said quite quickly, quite succinctly, psychoactivity cannot be unequivocally proven. They said the same thing on the 13th of July in a bit more detail, but the only definitive way of determining psychoactivity is via human experience, which is usually not documented. 17th of August, cannot be definitely proven. 23rd of October, at this stage nothing really has been done to the definition. The ACMD feel that the current definition on the face of the bill is too unspecific and does not adequately define a psychoactive substance. I don't know how many times your experts are meant to say to you, this cannot be proven. And with that, they have, as I understand, there is some discussion on actually developing in vitro tests, so test tube tests, which will aim to target receptors. So the discussion is called brain targeting. And so the idea that you will get the substance, have the receptor, and be able to test it against it and get a reaction from it. But I would argue a reaction in a test tube is not sufficient enough to show mental functioning or emotional state. That's what human beings do, potentially animals even. Also too, from a legal perspective, as a lawyer, there are so many problems with this. First of all, I don't believe it can be proven. Second of all, if they have specific labs that are licensed by the Home Office to do this, as a defence lawyer, how do you have proper probity? How can we challenge that? Will we go, yeah, you say it's psychoactive, of course it is. That's not going to happen. So in fact, I actually don't think there will be many prosecutions or any prosecutions under this Act. And just to highlight how bad it all is, this is the Minister for Drugs, Mike Penning, who when debating the Psychoactive Substances Bill asked, will the Minister outline for us just how this legislation will deal with those who sell or buy online? Now remember, I've shown you what the offences are. It will just be the same as if, his response, it will just be the same as if a person went to a head shop. It is illegal. People say to me that the web is so open, but at the end of the day, purchasing like selling is an offence. There's no offence of purchasing. This was our drugs minister in Parliament discussing the bill 6 months after it's been drafted. He then goes on to say, I apologise if I've confused the House. I kind of misled the House unintentionally on individual possession. I was talking about intent to supply, not intent to use. Now get this. Making a purchase from a foreign website would be caught, but the purchase on its own from a website or a foreign website would not. And I apologise if I have misled the House. Well, what you've just said is a tautology. It makes no sense. I've read it 3 times. I can't get it around. So just quickly, as I've said, it's unenforceable. This is legislation that's come, it mimics to some degree Irish legislation that was introduced in 2010. There is constant talk of 5 prosecutions in Ireland. We are still trying to find those prosecutions. When the detective DS, who leads the drugs squad in Ireland, says it's unenforceable, it's not perfect legislation, proving psychoactivity technically is really difficult. So we're relying on scientists to assist us with these prosecutions, and they haven't been able to provide us with the evidence to take it forward. It's not working. There's the evidence for the Home Office. But it does have an impact. So there is a voluntary response by head shops. And that voluntary response is to close. Panic sets in, they think the legislation, and there are elements of the legislation which will impact prohibition notices which can close down the head shops. So in those circumstances, we will probably see before the Act comes in, likely next April, a change in the head shop market. Either you will see shops just taking the MPSs out of them, or shops closing down as they work out that they can't sustain the financial model of the business. I have to say, I think there is some work to be done on whether the shops actually do provide some level of harm reduction. In Poland, they shut the shops again around 2012, I think it was, and since that time there's been an increase in the number of people being admitted to hospital for poisonings related to legal highs. I'm not saying that that's right, but I'd be interested to find out if they do. I'd be interested if the guys who run these shops think carefully about the products that are coming in, that they're not the worst type that's out there. You know, that they're slightly better, that there is some advice going on behind the counter, even though legally they can't do that. As I said, I don't know if that's true, but I think it's something that's worth investigating. In Ireland, what we did get, though, as I said, the head shop shut, 100 of them is estimated. Prevalence went up. So since the ban came in 2010, young people's use of drugs has risen from 16% of the youth population to 22%. The trade was displaced to online and to traditional street dealers, and there's some evidence to show that it was shifting to other illicit drugs, but whether that creates more harms or not, I'm not quite sure. So, get out there, tell people this is possibly one of the worst pieces of legislation that's ever been drafted. It is an affront to our civil liberties, it's an affront to our human rights, and it's an affront to our brains. So thank you very much.